confronted with in this situation was what would be the extended frame of reference? I mean, if you're going to play the game outside the frame, you have to supply a new operative context, a new frame of reference, as it were. And if it isn't really operative and it doesn't work, then you can't play the game out here because too much is lost. And that's an issue that I don't think too many artists have really dealt with. The second issue, which I find very, very compelling, is the idea that the history of modern art, being a radical history, has flattened the whole hierarchy of meaning and created a situation in which we have the necessity to struggle with what I would call a non-hierarchical structure. That is, no top and no bottom, no good, no clear good, bad, right, wrong, etc. Now, that appears to be almost nihilistic in a way. I maybe, hopefully, will illuminate that a little bit tonight. That's an issue that has to be resolved. What would a non-hierarchical structure look like, and how would it work? I mean, how will we actually do the kind of processing that we need to do to determine whether or not this experience is something that we can and will be involved in and such? I think those two questions, if they're not resolved, then basically the whole enterprise of so-called modernism is in great jeopardy. I don't know how many people are involved with the issue, but I find it really fascinating. A long time ago during this process, I became really a question junkie. And what that meant really was that I raised some questions for a very simple one. The first time I recognized the idea that all my activities as an artist were within a frame, I had never even thought about that. That's an incredible commitment. That everything you do, the whole idea of art, every kind of idea, emotion, feeling, what have you, operates within a frame is a very, very powerful idea. But at the same time, if I looked at it, me, just a naive artist in LA, I looked at it and thought to myself, that's not how I see the world at all. I mean, the world's not in a frame. The whole idea of framing, the whole idea of intellecting something, in a sense, which is that's crucial to our practices and our movement and our being in the world, is a way of seeing, but it's not the sum total of seeing. But actually seeing, as we all know, is very different. We move in the world in an envelope of our sensate being. We're being informed at every moment of all kinds of qualities of sound and feel and touch and warmth and cool and bright and colorful and red and green and so on and so forth. At all levels. It's like being in an envelope of continuous experiential input. And that's really very much a part also how we see the world. So I was presented with a very simple question. How can I confine all the things that I'm seeing and the things I became interested in, the shadow on a wall, the way something looked, the way I felt in walking through a space, etc. How can I confine that to this idea of the frame? It made no sense to me. So my question was good, even though for a very long time I have no ability to answer that or to resolve that issue. I'm still struggling with it in many ways. But when you play the game the way I'm playing the game, the question really becomes the critical issue. If at times you're stuck and you go back and you don't have an answer, but you go back and check your questions. If your questions hold water, then you're stuck with them. The second check, which is always a good one, is that on ideas as fundamental as that, where you're not going to know the answer, the answer may not be forthcoming in 100 years, may not become forthcoming in your lifetime in a way. But another way to check it is that if I'm thinking it, it's because it's thinkable, and therefore somebody else is doing it. And if I look at the other disciplines, physics, biology, music, etc., that if they're not people that are actually entertaining these same ideas, then there's something wrong with my compass. So it's another way of, in a sense, of looking at the character and the quality of the questions that we share. There's what I call a dialogue of eminence. That certain ideas become possible at certain moments in time. There are a lot of amazing examples of that in science. Watson and Crick with the double helix competing at the same moment with Linus Pauling here in California over the idea of one of the great discoveries of all time, the double helix, the beginning of the coding of human beings, life and such. Why at that moment? Why, in a sense, at that very moment, are more than one person thinking about on the edge of discovering this? They did this in the next few years. I can never remember her name. She is highly underrated. There was a woman who supplied some kind of, I don't know whether it was Kirlian photography, but some kind of smaller than the increment of light photography that gave them a kind of sense of the character of the double helix as such. Linus Pauling didn't have that, and that lacking piece of information is why he essentially did not discover it, and Watson Crick did. So there's this dialogue of eminence that goes on within all the whole process of questioning and looking at the world. I find that really fascinating. That's the thing that most excites me. The idea of communication, which is the more popular idea that art is about communicating, about expressing myself. I find these specious in the sense that I ask this simple question: do you think of anything that's not expression? Anything you do or don't do, any move or gesture you don't, on one level or another, is an expression. So obviously expression can't really be the issue. The second thing is the idea that the idea of communication. I ask you a couple simple questions: what, how, and to whom? What implies that something precedes the procedure of communication. And if that something is not of some significance, then it's just diarrhea of the mouth, or just expressing myself for the whatever the flavor in that is. But if you think about that for a moment, what is this something that precedes that procedure? It is obviously the obvious thing is knowing. So the idea of inquiring and really, in a sense, getting an understanding of something and beginning to, as it were, organize that within either your feeling or your mental structures so that it actually takes on some tangible form for you and has significance for you in a way, is something you can spend your whole life doing, which before you'd ever get around to whether or not to communicate it to somebody else. The second thing that takes place is how. I mean, think of the complexity. You have essentially come to this sense of being in the world, some sense of the character or quality or dimensions of something which we'll assume for a moment has significance, and no one has ever quite thought about it in the way that you've thought about it. And so the question of how would you do that becomes major in a way. You may have to redefine the idea of how words appear on a page if you're a poet. You may have to develop a 12-tone system if you're someone in the music world. You may have to redefine how one makes art and how it exists in the world so that it has the dimension and has the potential, since it's, in one sense, nothing more than an intersubjective tool. But it has to be an intersubjective tool that has the same dimensions as whatever it is you want or need to, as it were, put into the world. One can spend a lifetime on that, and you come up with any one of those things is a major accomplishment in itself. And then we come to the most obvious thing, is to whom. You sit down with your wife, you talk to her about politics and about life and about meaning and social actions and all the kinds of events that exist around you. And you may get to the point where the two of you can look at an event in the world and not have to say a word, because you've experienced this thing. You may look at each other, just a look or a smile or what have you, a non-verbal, a non-physical communication in the sense of an object between the two of you. We've all had that kind of experience. On the other hand, if I want to have a conversation with a half a dozen artists, say a young, interesting artist who have a knowledge of the same kinds of histories that I do, the same kinds of reference points, we can broaden our metaphors, we can broaden, in a sense, our language, we can, in a sense, use these relationships that we have in common, and we can, in a sense, talk in a rather, not a general way, but we can get quite specific about it. But if I start having an ambition, as it were, to change the world, to somehow affect the quality of things in the world, and I want to, as it were, influence you in this room, I would have to need to, in a sense, broaden my metaphors, broaden my references, and so on and so forth, to engage you in this. Now, that's not bad in a way, but you realize that this is what you've done, is put the cart before the horse. The communication now has begun to form the structure or the act itself, when actually knowing should be forming it. The process of knowing, the idea that art is something which is over the history of art has continually grown and changed. It's never stayed the same. As much as we talk about a high art and the idea of an art as being transcendent, which is a very beautiful idea, much as we speak of that, it's never stood still. It's always changed. It's continuously changing. So in a sense, there has never been an art which is art in the high sense of the word, as we often think about, or transcendent art. There are a number of arts that have happened over the history of cultures and cultures, which each one in a beautiful way represents a moment in time and defines for that time its import, its ideas, its values, etc. And each of those arts is art, but none of them is art per se. That as an artist, when you start in the world as an artist, one of the responsibilities you have is to find out who you are, where you are, and what are, in a sense, what is the history up to that point, what are the issues, what are the questions, where are we in this overall extended and running dialogue. It changes the rules of the game. So I would talk about the idea of an artist as a kind of pure inquiry. That is, dealing with an unknown. Not going off from anywhere, going off from a particular moment in time, a particular set of concerns, issues, and a particular history, and really trying to make some sense out of that as we move forward in it. But an inquiry about the nature of being an artist as such. So there's a basic issue which we tend not to ever think about or spend much time on, and that is the idea of why art. I mean, what is the subject of art, the fundamental subject of art that essentially is unique and makes a unique contribution to the overall dialogue of human beings in the world. It can't be as it was at one time. What made me think about that, just reading a little, I spent 3 days with Richard Feynman one time, and the first thing he said to me was, well, the problem with art is it doesn't have a subject, and which for me was like dead on. That's the problem. We don't essentially have this idea very clear that, in fact, artists don't even want to talk about it. It's much too ephemeral, much too difficult to write. But the person who had come the closest to it in a way, having talked about it up to that time in my life, was a guy named Ad Reinhardt, who made a great series of articles called Art is Art, As Art, and Everything Else is Everything Else. He came to LA one time when I was, I don't know, 23, 24, thinking I was an artist, and he gave a lecture at the Pasadena Art Museum. And he did this marvelous lecture. He slowly took apart all those things that were not art. Step by step. The idea that art essentially is in a sense a chronicler of events, or that art is in a sense a illustrator of the text, or that art is in a sense a potentially political activism, or that art is a social action, that art is a cultural action. All these ideas, he simply eliminated all of them. Everybody in the room getting really irritated. Half the artists that came was getting up, walking out, and so the place was half empty by the time we got to defining where he was, by defining where he was. It was a via negativa. It was one of the more interesting and stunning lectures I think I've ever been through in my life. He did it beautifully. He was also, in a sense, the problem for him in some ways, which is the lesson I learned from him, is he, like among all his friends, and by doing it this way, he was like a nun at a cocktail party. Nobody liked to have him around. He was much too tough a critic. He was much too harsh on any kind of lack of inquiry about the nature of art and such. His work, in a sense, was a perfect reflection of that. The black painting of the most subtle kind of relationship to brown, almost not visible, essentially eliminated everything that wasn't absolutely essential at that moment of standing there. But for me, that wasn't good enough. I felt that as Feynman said, you have no subject. And I think, we're building these incredible museums, making these, it's amazing what's going on there. Millions of dollars being spent solely on this cultural, social phenomena of art in the world. And if it doesn't do something unique or special, then we value it much too high. There's nothing wrong with it being a political forum, but at the same time as it's a political forum, I also could run for office, or I could, in a sense, support a candidate, or I could roll a bomb down the aisle and become an anarchist. I could essentially, all kinds of ways that I could express my political interests, all of which are, in a sense, varying worth. And so it's not an argument that there's nothing wrong with doing that, But there's nothing unique about that either. That's not something that is unique to the art. You know, there is something unique to physics. There really is something unique to biology. There really is things that are unique to mathematics. I mean, these things contribute in the world in absolutely spectacular ways. And each justifies it because it has its own real reason for being, its real area of dialogue. So the question is, why art? What is it that art contributes? And I would argue that all those secondary reasons are a piece and a part of a kind of running practice. That is, and I'll touch on that a little bit here. The idea of the art world in the hierarchical sense. Let me just go do that for a second. In the hierarchical sense of it, we have art. Well, let's just start out with, we have meaning. And on the basis of that meaning, which is a God on high, or the universe is orderly, or etc., that we are able to essentially lay out a series of activities, which essentially are from good to bad, right to wrong, etc., from visible or important to meaningless is the word. And art as a practice essentially cuddled itself up very close to this in a way, as an illustrator of the text, as someone who in a sense dealt with and enlightened not just the qualities of those ideas, that meaningfulness, will change it to some of that stuff out of it from hierarchy. And if that, in a sense, this history of art as such is structured and essentially from good art to bad art, it creates a real problem, essentially, for all of us as operatives in the world. The problem being that myself, who, of course, I've been an artist now for a long time, and therefore I'm people have honored me. I must be somewhere close to the deity. So if I were to teach at a university and hear all these students come in here at the bottom with their miserable little offerings, I'm able to enlighten them up to the meaning of art and the purpose of art and the technique of art and the process of art and so on and so forth. It works. Because in fact this is real and it's true. And it is one kind of knowing and one kind of the richness of the world. So I'm able to correct their actions because I can correct them in the light of the high art, or in the light of the ideas. Okay? It's a beautiful idea. If you think about the history of modern art, one of the things that's very clear is that it's a radical history. I mean, you start out with something so beautifully put together. I use the David's Coronation of Napoleon, a brilliant painting in the sense of its technical excellence. Not particularly a great painting emotionally or experientially, but a spectacular painting in terms of pinpoint perspective and the whole idea of spatial relationships. It's a spectacular painting. And the issue becomes very simply, why in the world would we take something so beautifully put together and take it completely apart? If you look at the 19th century, it's not something I did or that anyone in this room in a sense was a contributor in, but it is the history we're handed. There's a process of slowly dismantling the meaning of that structure. That instead of painting the highest and most august of figures or forms or patronage in the sense of the kings or the Burgermeister, what have you, it began more and more to deal with everyday things and everyday situations, all the way down to finally, in a sense, you're presented at the end of the 19th century, only 100 years, you're presented with a white square on a white ground, Malachi. Now, I say, why in the world would you do that? Too many people participated in that history with too many backgrounds and too many different motives for it to be accidental or incidental. So it may not be correct, but it is certainly something as a young artist you have to deal with. Why would we do that? What's that all about? And what kind of sense does it make? And what in fact is us? If you, in a sense, look at it from the point of view I'm saying here, that as you take the levels of meaning out of this thing, there's a couple of things going on in this hierarchy, in a sense, is also a process of judgment, how decisions are made, etc., and so on and so forth. If you take the meaning out of it, in a way, the hierarchy became less and less. You have luncheon on the grass, it's a woman in the neighborhood, she's even unclothed, and she's real, she's not a goddess. She's not Olympia, she's not somebody transcendent, she's somebody who can sit right next to you. And suddenly you have to deal with that reality on a very different level. And the process of meaning becomes less, but the process of participation becomes greater. As this thing flattens out, and we finally get to the point where so-called, when Malovich makes that white square on the white ground, even his friends, not just his enemies, but even his friends said, my God, Malovich, everything we know and love, everything we recognize, everything we believe in is gone. You left us with a desert. And he said, yes, but it's a desert of pure feeling. And philosophically, what he did at that moment was to make a really critical shift, and that is he placed the whole idea of experience to be the equal of an intellect. He made beauty the equal of truth, and set in motion in particular another kind of way of going in the world. In this process of getting to Malovich, we ultimately have what's called a marriage of figure and ground. And what happens there essentially is just that the hierarchy in a sense is completely flattened. There's no distinction between figure and ground, or meaning and meaningless. So the issue becomes, in a way, in modern art, when you want to take all of that meaning out. By the way, the second generation after that, it was a way of illustrating that. You think of the second generation after the abstract expressionists, essentially. What you have is after Malovich, you have Piet Mondrian, who essentially plays this thing off in a conceptual way. That is, he takes a drawing of a tree, he illustrates it beautifully. He was a great draftsman and drew the tree in the most perfect, beautiful, pictorial sense. And then slowly he changed the tree so that it became more and more about its physicality, more and more about how it occupied space, more and more essentially about its energy, until finally it came to the plus-minus paintings, in which it became pure energy. Pure energy, pure interaction of energy without form at all, in that sense of the word. After that, you have the abstract expressionists, who essentially supplied it into an entirely new visual vocabulary. And some people like myself attempted to try and find a vocabulary to deal with the non-material. Now that's a pretty radical history, and it's essentially connected all the way. But again, I'm saying it doesn't necessarily make it true, but it's something that we have to deal with here. Now, on the heels of abstract expressionism, why pop art? The explanation, I think, is fairly simple. I think that the really root element in abstract expressionism is that there was no meaning structure at all. There was no content. So when someone looked at that painting, one of the paintings, and said, well, what is it? Which people still do, which is to try and Rorschach it or somehow psychoanalyze it. They were still trying to find the content, still trying to find the meaning in it. And the abstract expressionist said, no, none. It is. And they talked about a kind of presence, a particularly different way of going about it, another different kind of understanding, a different kind of experiential process. Now, one thing that's really worth putting in place here, and very critical to this, is the history of modern art, as radical as it was. Almost all of our histories basically are homogeneous. And that is simply that our most basic concepts put in place and who have survived over very long periods of time and eventually may become belief structures, on the basis of their permanence, we build these amazing and complex structures that we call civilization. Every once in a great while, they essentially are put under question, in which it's not that they're necessarily wrong, but we find that the world is more complex. The simplest example is Einsteinian physics as opposed to Newtonian physics. The biggest difference is Einstein's physics did not in any way assault or disprove anything that Newton did. Everything he did was still in place and correct. It simply changed the dialogue in which Newtonian physics wasn't a worldview any longer. One had to deal with the thing as being a more complex set of problems, a more complex set of issues. So it was not an antithesis. It was not a sense nihilistic, and the whole history of modern art was never anything against or anti-pictorial reality. The fact of a pictorial reality existing and being as sophisticated and lasting as long and still going on, and will continue to go on. The idea that painting is dead is an absurd idea put forth by the conceptualists, which makes it most humorous, because the conceptualists who said that are the perfect or one of the best representations of the present pictorial art, in that everything they do is still a system of signs. We'll get into that a little bit, maybe if I take the time. But anyway, we get down to this non-hierarchical structure, and the question becomes, how and what way would that structure work, or does it work? Let me suggest that one of the problems with this high art, here's high art up here, like I say, and so somebody who is involved with social action or social kinds of game, or political games or whatever, are somewhere down here and not a part of the high desire. We want to get down to craft and fashion and so on and so forth. So we have high art and we have low art, or what we call it, which creates a problem in the sense that there's always an argument going on for who represents high art. And it's not in a sense kind of open dialogue in a way, it's a kind of a cat fight for who's on top. Let me just do a simple thing. Let's turn this hierarchy, what I call the hidden structure of the art world, let's turn the hierarchy on its side and look at what it really is, and that is, instead of being this way, put it this way. And think of it, art as a discipline. That is a discipline, it's a good word, not an accidental word. A discipline, in a sense, is how ideas are conceived and how they are slowly developed, maturated, brought into the social structure, and become a piece and a part of our everyday lives. So on one end of this thing, you have what I'll call the art of pure inquiry. Here's this infinite potential. The infinite potential of human beings to perceive and know the world as such. And so there is this continuous inquiry about that, and the whole history of art has always expanded our understanding of how and what way we see the world, how we decide what is and what isn't, and so on and so forth. This is, in a sense, an act of an individual. It is the only act which moves in the opposite direction, that is, away from the social core, away from the concept of social good in the immediate sense of the word. It may ultimately result in a meaningful action. It may ultimately result in changing something of great significance. But in the short term, there's no way, as a process of inquiry, to know whether or not that's true. And I talk about the idea of questions and pursuing questions. So this is art of inquiry, which is the act of single individuals. As those individuals begin to, as it were, develop and have an understanding of this, by the way, they're having, as I said before, a dialogue of eminence. Other people are probably have to be thinking that they're not, they're off on a bad track. So you have a way of thinking. What you have next is what I'll call a dialogue. I'm going to write it, you just can't read them anyway. A dialogue of colleagueship. That is that there are those other people who are thinking who I may have never met. I may have never had a dialogue with, and you see it all the time in Nobel Prize winners, where 3 or 4 people get a prize from living in different parts of the world with different methodologies who have arrived at the same conclusion or the same discovery at the same moment in time. In that idea, certain ideas are possible at certain moments in time, and that those people involved with that kind of dialogue are doing it. Now, you have this moment, as it were, where you start to have a dialogue of colleagueship. That is, those people begin to exchange ideas. It may be the first level of publication in the science world. It may be the first level of an artist making an action or putting it in the gallery, an exchange where I look at yours, you look at mine, and we're beginning to try and give this idea, which we now understand maybe intellectually or conceptually or within our emotionally or what have you, we begin to give some intersubjective form so that it has the potential to be made a part of social action, all right? This thing is illuminated during that period. And one of the key elements of being in this thing is the willingness to give up judgment for the moment. Because we're playing with an idea that we do not know the consequences or the properties of as such. So this idea of holding judgment in abeyance is a very particular kind of skill of the dialogue of colleagueship. And this goes on in the labs, this goes on in the universities, this goes on among all the working people who are playing with these ideas as such. And there's a kind of open exchange. At a certain point, this thing then begins to move in to what I'll call for us, the art of art. That is, artists essentially showing other artists, artists dialoguing with other artists, scientists dialoguing with dialoguing, and what have you, which we begin to really develop this idea. What we do, the key there, in a sense, is there already is a body of knowledge called science or physics or whatever. And it's not, in a sense, it's a highly sophisticated, very carefully coded body of knowledge, the body of knowledge of art. So in a sense, one of the things we need to do is take this new idea and essentially weigh it with and against that body of knowledge. Because a good idea and a powerful idea is not without consequences. In fact, it can be very destructive. So the first thing that needs to be done is discipline. It has to be weighed with and against the existing body of knowledge. One has to, in a sense, actually do the kinds of experiments, whether or not a lightweight bends around a gravity field. Spend 10 years of their life in the way, or maybe on the basis that they think it's a beautiful idea, and begin to try and underpin that thing with some actual facts and such. So there's this whole art of art and the process in which we act and interact as an operative community. By the time we finally put, in a sense, this into a form which is, in a sense, now has, in a sense, a structured understanding, in a sense, now has some, has already been weighed, as I say, with and against the ideas, and we can consider the possibility of modifying the body of knowledge or changing the body of knowledge, which you don't do just ad hoc. That's a very, very, in a sense, not sacred, but it's a very crucial ground to which all these activities take place. And as we go this direction, we are, in a sense, more and more becoming involved with the concept of social goods. That is, this idea now has potential, has the properties to act in the world, and in a sense, the premise is that these will improve the quality of our lives, etc. We move now into the area of art is social action. That is, the Marxists would say that this is where art really is. This is art for the social action. In fact, all this is just sort of bourgeois bullshit. And so they would essentially make a new hierarchy in which they would take this thing and arch it up and call this art. Each of these making claims of sorts to themselves, trying to go back to the hierarchical thing. The thing that happens is that this idea of social action is in fact very meaningful. It's a part of it. And it's a very simple thing. It's the old adage that a tree falls in the forest. Do we hear it? In a sense, does it have consequence? This idea, if it's not eventually has fruition and in some way changes and alters our life, then it's a meaningless idea. It has no worth at all. So in a way, at one time, maybe Einstein would, for the moment, stop doing what he was doing originally to come up with that, and he writes a primer on his ideas and on his thoughts. And he writes that primer because that's now social action. He's trying to make the idea open and available as such. So we're not nailed in any one of these areas. We can move up and down. After this, we have the art, in a sense, of social practice. That is what we call culture, the art of culture. What happens is this idea now has gone through all these processes. It's become a social action. It is now beginning to be wedded into our lives. We think of it as ours, something that represents us, our values, and who we are. And so we develop that in allowing it to affect all the kinds of nature, the way we lay out, the way we order our lives, the way we order our things, the kind of clothes we wear, our ideas about beauty, our ideas about meaning, and so on and so forth. It now illuminates and actually enriches our life. Without it enriching our life, the act, as I say, is a meaningless act. And finally, then you have the art of historical form. And that is, basically, history is not a history of everything. It is a very careful culling of the import of all these activities and the process of forming and reforming and reshaping the body of knowledge. If you put this on a Mobius strip, it might make more sense, but it still wouldn't make enough because it doesn't move in this kind of progression. All of us, in a sense, have a history. All of us are social activists in a way. All of us are philosophers in a way. We all ask ourselves, why do I do what I do? What's the importance of my life? Why am I doing the things I do? We may not have answers for them, but those dialogues we have with ourselves do change our lives in time. So if you look at this process, each of these things does something that is absolutely important or unique, and therefore you can't trick them into a hierarchy. You can't say that one is more important. You can't say that the idea of really good clothing design or the idea that it's a real craft and whatever, that every society has those, is a piece and part of the richness of being in the world as such. And you can't say that they're less important than this. because you can't subsume one to the other. As far as I can tell, none of these, in a sense, is irrelevant. You can't take any of them out. So you have essentially the potential of a non-hierarchical structure, and it becomes, in a sense, now a dialogue in which one can think about the import of, say, an area. Let's just say that we'll put our guy he's an engineer, he's a bridge builder, which happens to be one of the most interesting things going on right now in the engineering world. Some of the spectacular bridges people are building. The key to making a bridge is this thing is more than he is not an pure inquirer. He's not making bridges exactly the way they were built before. The art of making a bridge is the perfect balance between the potential to build a bridge, i.e. without it falling down, or the history of building bridges. So the state of the art in bridge building continually moves and is continually focused between these two poles of stuff, and sets up in a sense an operative parameter, which is what appears to be lost when you make a non-hierarchical structure. The parameter before being good and bad, we always right and wrong, etc. And so forth. Here you have the same kind of operative frame of reference, which is absolutely crucial, and but at the same time, it's a constantly moving, constantly evolving practice. How long have I been doing this? I don't know where you have too much. I knew that it was to me a little different in that I had this whole exhibition down there, and there's certainly no reason to show slides of it. You've probably seen it. And there was no reason to really talk about it. It's already there. It speaks for itself. So the question became all day long, what the heck do I talk about? You know? And while this is the kind of thing I like to talk to students about, and not really in a sense to get them to believe it or not believe it, but to say that the practice of being an artist is really a very interesting activity, and it has potential. But all these areas of art all have their value, and they all have their things. You can't, in the word, teach somebody to be a kind of artist. One of the issues about thinking, in a sense, is that in 10 years you have no idea what they're going to do, and they have no idea what they're going to do. So if you start telling them what art is now, all you've done is burden them with an old idea. It's like a lead weight. You really, in a sense, try and work with them to prepare their ability to develop their own sensibility, to be able to, sense over a period of time, recognize and, as it were, develop their own practice, to be their own disciplinarian, to be their only really good critic. I was asked today what I thought about. I had a long dialogue with, I guess, published for a show, Weschler Alive. He was really quite a spectacular young man, extremely interesting, extremely bright. It was very fun for me because all through my practice as an artist, I've never had anybody work for me. Never had a secretary or somebody who was a studio assistant or something. And the reason being because when I walk through a space, if you're walking with me, I cannot totally attend the space. I have to attend you to some degree, maybe out of politeness and maybe out of an old habit my mother gave me, but I can't just ignore. And so I'm, in a sense, involved, but I'm not involved. And the only way I can really do it is to be absolutely hands-on. Now here's Laura's president. Ola Eliza. Here's Ola Eliza. Has 50 people working for him. Has his own resident philosopher. He has scientists. He has optical engineers feeding him amazing kinds of information, amazing techniques and stuff. And I'm watching this thing from where I'm sitting. It cannot be anything but fascinating. I mean, absolutely just, I'm really interested. I mean, it's like a whole other world, a whole other kind of activity in the world. I'm looking at it on one hand, envious of all the kinds of information he's being fed. I could have used a lot of that stuff. I mean, I fumbled along from here to here, every now and then getting a little help from my friends and what have you. And some people I've met, I was lucky enough to meet some people who informed me along the way in the dialogue. But going through that whole thing, and on one level I was totally envious of him, okay? On the other level, I felt he had one problem. And the one problem that he has is he really needs that. He doesn't have a good shit detector. When you got all that much stuff coming, all that possibilities, there's hundreds of them, man, you got to have some kind of really good shit detector. So right now, which doesn't mean it's ongoing. So right now, he's just letting it all out, which is maybe not a bad way to go. Just letting it go, let it flow right now, and then developing over a period of time and refining and in a sense come back. I mean, it's for me a really fascinating thing. It's another generation, another whole world. It's interesting to see in a sense. I mean, I still think I'm playing the game at LACMA right now with my my palm garden. Hopefully I can turn some corners on that. But at the same time, and I'm watching a generation flow past me. It's like 200 miles an hour, and I'm really fascinated to see what goes on. I'm stopping now because I don't want to burden you with too much here. I hope this made a little bit of sense. All I was trying to really illustrate is that the practice of being an artist is not an idle activity. Let me give a simple illustration here, which I've come to love, actually, so I do it all the time. But I open my eyes in the morning, and the world appears totally formed, as if given. So I swing my legs around the end of the bed, and the entire world goes with me, and completely accounted for. I mean, amazing how a whole new set of facts and interests in parts and pieces, all accounted for, the changes of equilibrium and so on and so forth. There it is, totally accounted for. I don't ask myself, how did I do that? I just get up and take a shower. Okay? If I were to lay there for even an instant, two amazing things are revealed, which is right at the heart of this whole dialogue. One is, I form it. It's not given. It is constantly and totally malleable. That as human beings, we actually actively form the world continuously. Now that is in a sense modified constantly by the structures we have, in which we are very selective about what information we let in, what information is critical and crucial and so on and so forth, but we do in fact form it. And the second, which is the most spectacular of all, is that I couldn't move. If you had to lay there for even an instant while it was forming, you'd be unable to move because every moment would be a forming moment. Think about how spectacular human beings are. It also points to something that I think is very interesting, is that our desires, especially in within the physical sciences, and the whole idea of objective view of the world, we feel that the thing has to be resolved one way or another. So all the biologists, to a great degree, or all the so-called mind people that are looking at, not all, but a great majority of them, still think that it can be resolved one way or another. The spectacularness of human beings is that they're both true. They're co-arising, they are immediately, they're co-arising, they are mutually dependent and mutually exclusive at all times. That at any time that bridge there, it would corrupt the ability of the two to work. There are like two levels of knowing. One is our sentient being, and the other is our intellectual self. And they each inform us in a different way. They are each rich and they are each critical. If you want to know what to do, to do a particular task, one may variously be better than the other, but one is not exclusive of the other. They're never separate from each other. The human being, I mean, that to me, buy it or not buy it, but that is one of the great mysteries and one of the great beauties of being a human being in the world, and why human beings, individual human beings, are the great, in a sense. What's the word I want to use? We're the great miracle. We're the power. One of the mistakes we make is every time we, in a sense, get a really good idea, an epiphany, a moment of sudden enlightenment away, we tend to want to give it away. It came from on high. It came from outside me. It came from here. It came from there. I'm not the source of it. You're not only the source of it, you're the responsibility for it. And that's one of the fun things about being an artist, is taking on all that. Thank you. not just an idle game. It actually has some significance. Okay. My pleasure. The reason I don't answer questions, the last time I was here, I had a question and answer, okay? And I had some paintings in the show here, and someone asked me, Mr. Irwin, how do you feel about your painting, your line painting, how it's hung in the gallery? And it was a line painting hung right up against the edge. And so I diplomatically said, well, it's not how I would do it. And old Lefty Adler, sitting right about there, stood up and said, take that son of a bitch to the Jack in the Box. So I didn't get that.